My friends invited me to a party, and even though I didn't feel so into it, I couldn't decline their invitation. The three of them, Sam, Diana, and Pinky, were starting to think I was avoiding them. If I wanted to clear up the misunderstanding, I didn't have a choice but to follow them wherever they wanted me to go. Or maybe I had a choice, and I wanted out like they were suggesting. The party was held at a clubhouse. Sometimes I wondered if I was avoiding the three of them on purpose like they supposed I was, because no matter what they did, I was never pleased. I couldn't tell if they were the selfish ones or if I was. They knew I was not a lover of night outings, especially if all roads led to a clubhouse. Yet they were asking me to go with them to one. I hated the smell of booze and sweat. I didn't particularly fancy dancing and every other thing that happened at such parties, but they claimed that they were bringing me out to get out of my shell, helping me live my best life. If I was being honest with myself, the best life was the one without them. One that I could live in the confines of my rundown room. The only thing my mother, who died of cancer a few months ago, handed over to me. Or maybe it wasn't, but how could I tell? I was getting more used to being alone than being with them. I couldn't blame my friends. They probably thought my mother's death was starting to throw me into a state of depression. And I was thinking so too. They probably thought I was losing my mind, and I would die slowly if they left me in the confines of that room. For their sake, as well as mine, that night at the party, I loosened up and allowed myself to feel whatever they felt whenever they were at those parties. I wouldn't know what it was that they felt, but after a few minutes on the dance floor, I was stripped of whatever worries I carried along with me to the party. The music flooded my head and swept through my body in a mesmerizing manner. The feeling was the opposite of the comfort my room gave me. It wasn't quiet or eerie. The clubhouse didn't smell like a rotting body or dampness, but it eased my soul and gave way to a sort of freedom that I never felt before. Suddenly, I wondered why I'd never tried it before. I didn't like parties still, but I loved that one in particular, especially when a hot-looking guy stood dancing by my side, obviously seeking my attention. My hands found their way to his biceps, tracing his chiseled body, and the weakness of my knees led me to dance with him. His hands were all over me, and I didn't care. I loved the idea of someone being interested in me. I glanced over at my friends where they sat watching me shake my body all over. They smiled at me in amusement, wowed by the level of craziness I was displaying. It wasn't long before the guy pulled me out of the dance floor and we settled in a booth. We ordered some wine and I didn't have any energy to decline. Something was enchanting about the way he spoke, the way he stared into my eyes, the way he held my hands and filled my glass with wine. When he pushed my glass into my hand, I brought it to my mouth and emptied it in one gulp. The clubhouse was no longer noisy, and it was just myself and the guy. I was starting to relish the night's party. At that stage, I thought perhaps my friends were right, and I needed some freedom. If only I knew that the alcohol was just messing with my head. The man asked if I would like to follow him to his house, or if I would rather take him to mine. I shook my head and responded that my mother would kill me if I brought a man home to my house for a one-night stand. He chuckled and whispered into my ear that he knew that I was living alone. Tingles spread through my veins and butterflies rumpled at my stomach. I was mesmerized by his voice and whispers. I didn't know when I let him out of the clubhouse and when we were headed to my house. I led him into my room, not caring that it wasn't in the right state or presentable enough. My neighbors saw me enter the house, and I thought I saw a twinge of irritation in her eyes, but I didn't care. My mother was gone, and no one had the right to mother me or watch whatever I did. I was living alone after all. My young man didn't seem to care either, because soon we were in each other's arms, the place where I had the best night of my life since my mother died. The shock, however, came the next morning when I woke up, conscious and aware of the pleasure I had the previous night. Except that the situation around me didn't match up with the thoughts in my head. I was fully clothed in my party dress. It wasn't scattered around the room as I imagined. Was it possible for a person to redress after a night of pleasure? The house also held no sign of a visitor, or that I slept with a man in the same house. It was clean and neat, not messy as I imagined before bringing him into the house. I checked around the house and saw nothing. It creeped me out even more because I lived alone and there was no one to ask about his whereabouts. My heart sped in different directions as I tried to make some sense of what was going on. I decided to turn to the only person that I knew that could have an answer, my neighbor. I stepped out of my house and came in contact with the same woman I saw the previous night when I came with my visitor. Despite my embarrassment, I asked if she saw him leaving that morning, but said that I didn't come home with anyone, that I was alone. I thought she was trying to scare the wits out of me until I called Sam and he said the same. I left the club by myself after ordering 3 bottles of wine and drinking them in large gulps. They tried to stop me, to call a cab and help me, but I pushed them away and disappeared into the night. They were worried, but they figured I would get home safe nonetheless. I would never understand if my handsome guy was imagined or real. Sometimes I blame it on the alcohol. Other times I conclude that it was only a silly dream as a result of a disorienting night and whatever happened in my mind going through another routine. Either way, I will never go to night parties anymore. Neither will I have a taste of any form of alcohol. I always had the sense that there was something strange about old Mr. Rogers' death. He was old, about 83 years old, and from the atmosphere at his funeral, it was evident that he lived a full life, even though he lived alone for most of his older days. He had friends, and I was one of his younger friends during his old days. Old Mr. Rogers was my neighbor, and he was a good neighbor. He concerned himself with the business of his plants. He maintained and groomed a small batch of tomatoes in a bucket, which he grew with such tenderness and care. I would tease him sometimes about his plants, and he would simply laugh it off in his usual way. He loved his plants like he loved his family, and he never seemed to bother anyone. At least, not that I knew of, because he lived alone, and I lived next door. He was not so springy, but he could carry himself just fine. Then, he was dead. It was strange. But that was last month. It was strange for 2 reasons. Our apartment was old, and there hadn't been anyone else other than the 3 of us neighbors in the apartment, and all 3 of us lived alone. It was Matt, who owned a cat, and that was the only thing he talked to and loved. Old Mr. Roger, who owned the plants and gave all his affection and time to. Then there was me, the girl, who loved my job because I didn't know what to do with my neighbors. The rest of my building, about the 3 apartments, were unoccupied. The first strange thing about the incident was that it was first labeled a murder. Matt was always quiet, but his cat had been quiet for a few days before Mr. Old Roger's death, and I discovered that he had left a note in the mailbox that he would travel to his mom in the South, and it had been old Mr. Rogers and myself in the building. No one knew that, so Matt and I had been suspected, but I had an alibi and CCTV footage at work that cleared me off my charges. Matt's mom and his alibi checked out from the South when she was reached. Then the police declared that there was no foul play and it was ruled a suicide. The second strange thing was just how quickly the police turned it around, saying that he killed himself. He loved his plants too much. The case plagued my mind, and I often thought about it when I was at work at the local coffee shop, and when I was home alone in the building. Sometimes I would lay in bed and wonder why. There was no objective motives. We cannot understand why a person would kill. It's subjective, and until a killer is brought in, we cannot say why they did it. The sheriff said to me when they had been cleared, "It's like thunder. These things occur. It would be a shame if thunder struck at the same spot twice. I didn't think about the words too much during the day, but at night, I had such vivid recollections of everything that occurred. I suffered the silence of the night to linger when I reminisced the sound of old Mr. Roger going about his day, watering his tomatoes. Last night was one such night. The thought of old Mr. Rogers kept me up for significant parts of the night, and I stayed up on my phone as I thought about it more, almost conjuring the sweeping feeling of his presence in my mind that I began to hear the pattern of foot drops in my head. I shrugged it off and continued on my phone. I tapped the screen and it revealed that it was late at night. 2 a.m. God, I'll be damned. I scoffed, mentally distracted. Unmistakable foot drops. My body turned rigid and my blood pumped cold, causing my heart to snap. The heat of my breath burned on my upper lip and my head banged. The cascading down of sensations made me numb for seconds, and in my hay numbness, I heard the noise of marching ever more clearly. I rolled over in my bed as the noise moved closer. I had the better mind to run for the door, but I decided against it. My mind was so dizzy with thoughts, and I instinctively ducked underneath my bed when a key clicked into my door. I pressed my hand over my mouth, smothering the heaves of panic that escaped my lips. The pores of my face and body poured forth with release. I soaked up the sweat with my own dread as the door yawned open. Fucking bitch, the voice growled as it scanned the room to find my absence. He watched for a bit, hesitant to move further, and as though suddenly, the legs moved towards my bed with fury. It was a man I identified. Where could she have gone? He threw a tantrum briefly and stood up from the bed. Then, he picked up himself with a throwing heave as he stepped back towards the door. He held it slightly ajar and started to laugh. Cindy Logan, I know you're in this room. I can smell you, he said. My life dashed before my eyes, and the moment of horror made my stomach tighten. I felt the pressure of life around my throat, and I suffocated from fear. In the chaos of my mind, I tried to make sense of the voice, and when the first thought struck me, I gasped. Gotcha. It was the sheriff. He turned away from the door and started to saunter towards me with a reckless fury. I had begun to whimper underneath the bed, scared for the worst to happen. I shut my eyes and said in a hurried prayer for help. My lips were still quivering when I heard a loud bang from the door. It was a noise, so sharp it rocked the room. The gun clicked a second time, and the bang rocked again. The sheriff fell onto the bed, and his dead weight made the bed frame creak. I squealed. Come out, Cindy. He's dead. The one who had shot him, in the deep reverberating bass, was the voice familiar to me. It was Matt. Matt? I called out from under the bed, realizing myself that I had been snotty and sobbing. Matt had never spoken to me. That was payback for killing my cat and Mr. Old Roger, Matt said as I crawled out from under the bed. Matt stepped into the bedroom. When he killed my cat, I was distraught. Then I saw him kill Mr. Old Roger. No one would believe them if I told him who killed Mr. Roger. But I knew you would believe me when he came for you.
The night was quiet, and the weather was chilly as I opened my front door. I just finished my 6-hour shift and was exhausted. All I wanted to do was get myself a highly needed shower and then go and sleep. I got inside and switched on the lights and hung my coat. I sighed and silently made my way to the bathroom. I'd been living alone for about 2 years now. It had its perks and downsides. One of the major downsides was the loneliness that accompanied it. Though my parents wanted me to come back home, I knew I needed to be on my own. I was a 25-year-old woman. I wasn't a child anymore. As I stepped out of the shower, I heard a noise from my bedroom and froze. What could that be? I shrugged. Perhaps it was a bird hitting the window glass. I wrapped myself in a towel and went into the room, feeling a bit refreshed. I frowned at the open window. I could have sworn that I locked it before going to work. Did I open it when I got back? I couldn't remember. I changed into my pajamas and was about to get into my bed when I heard a noise from somewhere in the house. I groaned, going to check the source of the noise. It was probably the wind that knocked something over. All the lights in the house were on, so I clearly saw the intruder when I came out of my room. I halted in my tracks, and before I could scream, he placed a finger to his lips. I swallowed my scream of terror and gulped. My eyes went wide and my breaths came in faster. The man in my house was wearing a black shirt with black jeans. He had a nose mask on, so I couldn't tell what he looked like. His eyes were the only features I could see as he stared at me coldly. I shook where I stood, every form of fatigue exiting my body just like that. "It's going to be better for the two of us if you remain quiet. Do you understand?" he asked in a raspy voice. I nodded vigorously, my mind racing. I couldn't call for help as my phone was in the room. I could only comply with his instructions and pray that he wouldn't hurt me. He told me to go sit down, and I obeyed him, keeping him in my line of sight. He was a thief, and he came up to me and asked me where I kept my money. I told him I only had $20 in my purse, and I could give it to him if he wanted. He was displeased about that and shook his head. As he opened his mouth to say something, there was a loud thunk from my room. I swallowed, scared to death. My intruder put a finger to his lips and silently crept to my room. Before he could get there, another man strolled out of my room, halting in his tracks when he saw us. Unlike the first guy, he was wearing a gray shirt and black trousers. He didn't attempt to hide his face, and I took in his features. My first intruder snarled and pounced on him, causing both of them to land on the floor in an undignified heap. I saw their blows landing on each other and winced before returning to my senses. I knew I could call the cops while they were distracted. I stood up slowly and edged towards my room. I got to the entrance of my room, and the black shirt guy looked up from where they were pummeling each other off the floor. I stopped, heart in my throat. He spat the blood in his mouth out and told me to return to my seat. I turned back and walked slowly back to where I was sitting. When I looked back, the gray shirt guy was now the one with the upper hand. I decided that I wouldn't just sit there like a useless person. I looked at the front door. It was locked, but my keys were in the lock. That was good. Without looking back again, I ran towards the door. Unfortunately for me, I tripped and fell down on my face. I yelled out in pain. It really hurt. I tried to stand up immediately, but a hand grabbed me by the ankle and dragged me back. I whimpered, trying to hold onto the floor. My efforts proved futile. Both of them loomed over me, and I started begging. Tears were running down my face as I cried. I guess the threat of me escaping banded them together. They sat me down on the chair. Then they started looting my house. They both came with sacks, and I could only watch in fear as they discussed among themselves which items they wanted. When their sacks got heavy, the black shirt guy suggested that they should leave. But the gray shirt guy had something else in mind. He came over to where I was and caressed my thighs. I leaned away from his touch, repulsed. He grabbed my hair and yanked my head back. I gritted my teeth from the pain. His grip on my hair was strong. "Now you do as I ask you. Is that clear?" I nodded, trying to hold back my tears. "Man, leave her. We gotta go," the black shirt guy said, looking uncomfortable. Gray shirt didn't respond. He just let go of my hair and grabbed the hem of my shirt. I squealed and tried to move back. A punch landed on my stomach and I saw stars. It hurt to breathe. I gasped for breath and tried to see past the pain. I wasn't sure if I had screamed. Blackshirt yelled at him and told him to stop. He said they already got what they wanted and could leave. When the gray shirt didn't respond, the black shirt threw me a sympathetic look and walked to the front door. He unlocked my door and went out. I was all alone with the gray shirt monster. I struggled with him as he still tried to pull up my shirt. He slapped me, and my head whipped to the side. I tasted blood in my mouth. I was fully crying now, from fear and pain. My hands went weak, and I surrendered to him. A slow grin crept on his face, but disappeared just as fast when the sound of sirens filled the air. He looked up, shocked, then stared at my door. Anger filled his face, and I just tried to remain as still as possible. He ran towards the front door, stopped, and then ran to my room, presumably to escape through my window. Just as he got into my room, my door got kicked open and the cops poured in. I pointed in the direction he went and they chased him. An ambulance was called for me, and I spent about 3 days in the hospital before I got discharged. I was told that they received an anonymous call that I was being robbed. I knew it was the black shirt guy. I didn't know whether to be grateful. The monster was caught, and I testified against him. I moved out of that house and found one where I had a roommate. I wouldn't want to go through something like that ever again. This feels like an eternity ago. Back in the dark ages of the 2000s, I had turned 16, and immediately my dad wanted me to finally go out and earn some cash to bring home. So he found me a job in a factory which made contact lenses. I had no option but to join it. The job was laborious and paid extremely little, so I was skint from the moment I even had the chance to make any money. I would come home each night, bleeding from my fingertips after the long day of packaging, placing, and carrying boxes, only to be met with a snarky, "Hello, John, how much today?" from my dad, who then held his hand out awaiting his payment. I was forced to give him every single penny I'd made that day. Sometimes, when the pay wasn't satisfactory for him, he would grab me by the throat and shake me until I either passed out or escaped his grip, only to then run upstairs to my room, holding the door closed with every single drop of willpower I had left within me. He would scream at me all night long, phrases like, "Come out here now! I know you're hiding the real amount!" Would bellow through the walls right until the morning sun dawned and enveloped the house in a faint glow of warmth and light. Eventually, he would leave me to return downstairs to grab a beer, and after guzzling it down, he would stomp back up the stairs and enter his cave of a bedroom after a full night of verbal abuse. Once I heard his bedroom door slam shut, I knew I had around 2 hours of sleep before my shift started. Missing any shift would result in a punishment you'll experience for the rest of your life, alluding to the fact he was either threatening to kill me or break a couple of limbs off of me to cover for the measly loss of the amount I'd earned per shift. My mother was no better. She would often come home early in the morning after a full night of drowning her liver in alcohol, just to take half the money without my dad knowing, to then spend on the next night of frivolity. But if the money was short, she would break into my room, come close to me, and whilst digging her spiny nails deep into my flesh, she would whisper, "Come home with less than that again and the arm's coming off." She would then leave to go and sleep for a couple of hours, slamming the door behind her. Once both of those vile creatures, supposedly called my parents, were asleep, I would usually then creep out of my room, down the stairs, trying with all my might to not creak any of the steps. Alerting either of them that I was out of my room would end in several volleys of fists and shouts to punish me for not being at work yet. Neither of them worked. They spent their lives living on the tiny portion of money given to us through benefits, and using me as their personal slave to go out, work an 8-hour shift, come home, and hand them the money. The cycle never seemed to stop. I tried going to school some days when they were both out, but the instant I got home and I had no money to hand them, they each broke out into an ape-like fit of rage and would lock me up in the attic. One time, they left me there for 3 days without any food or water. My instincts allowed me to drink the moisture on the windows. Once I realized it wouldn't be enough to survive on a couple milliliters a day, I was forced to drink something else. Something I'm too embarrassed to tell you, just for the sake of survival. That life I was trapped in. It was like the deepest depths of Tartarus itself. Yet I was punished merely for being alive. I simply wasn't able to take it anymore. One day I decided it was time to act. Deep down, I knew my parents were oversaturated in the pleasure. The constant substance abuse had made their frail, middle-aged bodies deteriorate over time, with only the adrenaline caused by self-inflicted fury keeping them from collapsing into a heap of fatty flesh on the floor. This made them easy targets. I woke up one morning with the plan in my head. The previous night, when I arrived home with the full money in my hands to give to Mom and Dad, this is what they told me.
I'm fed up with this measly pay. If you aren't earning double by at least tomorrow, you'll spend a week in the attic.
My dad sneered at me, snatching the money out of my quivering palms. Fear slowly encroached upon me. But that fear had been so commonly felt that a new emotion came into play. Rage. For once, I felt gifted with the realization that this wouldn't end until they did. And knowing where the house phone was, it was finally time I brought their tyrannic reign of violence to an end. Knowing they were still both asleep, I crept down the stairs for a final time, not paying as much attention to the volume of my steps this time. It would be a mistake for them to try and approach me now. I reached the bottom of the stairs moments later, feeling the adrenaline in my blood surging throughout me. Not yet its peak, that would come soon. I crept into the kitchen, reached for the phone that sat on top of the kitchen counter, and clutched it firmly in my hand, staring at it with a seething frustration that it was there all along. This could have ended sooner.
Hello, this is the police.
Hi. I'd like to report a case of domestic abuse. I told them everything with a wide grin on my face, the adrenaline surging through me, and tears flooding down my face. I was so relieved to finally be calling someone who could actually help, who could save me. They came around in just under 10 minutes. My parents were both already downstairs by then. They had heard me talking on the phone and were trying to figure out who on earth I was talking to when the police burst through the door, rushed into the kitchen, and handcuffed them. They were taken away shortly after, still kicking and screaming. The police then gently asked me if I wanted to be brought into custody so they could keep an eye on me while everything was sorted out. I obliged. I had nowhere else to go. In the interrogation room, with the interrogator's grimaced look staring empathetically at me, I looked up, disillusioned, as if reality had still not caught up with me. The authorities released me to go live with some relatives for a while, as my parents had their crimes charged and sentenced. I found out about 3 months later that both were down for 8 years each on domestic abuse charges. I felt a wave of glee crash over me. They were finally gone. I stepped into the office feeling uncertain. My previous workplace had been extremely toxic, so I had to resign. It was quite easy to get this job. I'd had a few experiences as a professional photographer for various event magazines, and I knew just how to capture moments at any event. Little had I known how much I had been sought after by this company. The soft, pink-themed environment poured a homey feeling all over me. It felt so amazing. I'd been given a personal office, a first in my 6-year career, and it was in a cozy, quiet corner. I moved through the tables in the open office, which was designed for the multiple writers and journalists that filled the first floor. I returned the greetings of my new colleagues and settled down in my office. Time to get to work. I got out my laptop and looked through the events I'd covered in my previous job. The smile of the celebrity bride looked genuine enough as she stared lovingly at her new husband. My old boss had called it cliché trash, but the editorial board of Finesse magazine loved it. I felt so appreciated from the very moment I stepped into the interview room. There was a knock on the door. I put my laptop to sleep as my new boss, Mr. Caleb, walked in. I rose and smoothed my pants. "You settling in fine, Justin?" "I am, thank you," I replied as he sat in one of the chairs opposite mine. I also took my seat. He informed me of a special event that he needed me to cover. It was a secret event that the magazine desperately needed, and he believed that I was the right man for the job. "It's extremely confidential, and it should be kept between the two of us. I'm aware you're a smart man. I've watched your work over the years, and I've noticed how subtle and meticulous you are. You can blend into the crowd and produce a wonderful result. I'm counting on you." He promised to give me more details as soon as he was sure that I could be trusted. But he left me confused. I wasn't expecting this on my very first day at work. Secrets? Confidentiality? What was next? Skeletons under my table? I attended 3 events that day and returned to work to do some editing. By the end of the day, Mr. Caleb visited me again, asking me if I would be able to cover the secret event. Being a lover of adventure, I'd considered his offer throughout the day, so I said yes. He seemed pleased, but not quite convinced, but he promised to give me the rest of the details the next day. I couldn't sleep that night. My eyes were wide awake as I stared at the ceiling. What kind of job did Mr. Caleb have for me? The next day, my boss showed up at my office as expected. He asked for the pictures taken the previous day, then moved to the real business. He told me about a group of elites who believed that they ran the town. He had gotten a tip that they had meetings every Friday by midnight at an abandoned bungalow, and he needed someone reliable to take pictures for proof. He had tried time after time to uncover the dirty secrets of the elites without any success. He revealed how he had owned a popular crime magazine, but it had been closed off by the elites. I listened to him with budding excitement as I formulated a plan. I had to be there during the secret meeting. That Friday, I wore my most inconspicuous clothes, a black hoodie and black pants with a face cap. I drove towards the darker part of town and parked 2 streets before the street where the abandoned building stood. It was dark when I got to the building and found my way to the basement. I put on my torch when I was sure that the place was empty and looked around. The basement was empty, but candles stood at different positions in the room. A stain that was possibly blood was splattered on the floor. Something terrible must have happened here. I took a few pictures and kept looking around. I couldn't continue my observation because I began to hear noises. I turned off the torch and ran to the hiding place which Mr. Caleb had told me about. I got a good view from the corner where I stood. The dim light was turned on as men and women began to walk into the room with red hooded robes. I took a few pictures. I tried to see the faces, and a few were familiar. The mayor, the town doctor, the man who owned almost all the grocery stores in town, and the rich heiress whose son got married last month were amongst the few. I was terrified, but also excited. I continued to take pictures as the 11 elites began to make weird noises that sounded like chants. Someone lit the candles and the dim light was turned off. "The time has come to renew the oath we took. The time has come to complete the circle of brotherhood," the grocery store owner began, while the others sighed in agreement. "We have been 12 since the death of old Gordon, and we need someone fresh to complete the circle." I wondered why they kept saying they were 12. I could see just 11 people, so someone was missing. "Let's begin the ritual." I took a few pictures as they brought out a goat. Were they going to sacrifice it? They began to increase their chants, and they seemed to go into a trance-like state. "Bring him in," the grocer said. I felt so intrigued. Mr. Caleb would be so proud of me. I hadn't only uncovered a secret cult, I was about to discover their new member. I kept taking pictures until I froze. Someone tapped my shoulder. I turned around in terror, and the person hushed me. Mr. Caleb? What was he doing here? I was about to ask why he couldn't trust me when my eyes fell on his clothes. For a moment, my heart skipped a beat. He was wearing the red robe. He was a part of them. And then it all dawned on me. I was the new arrival, and I was in deep trouble. The old man could sense that I had connected the pieces. His grin shone through the dark. Follow me and join the Brotherhood. If you do, you will live. I detected the undertone. If I didn't follow him, I would die. So I followed him, obediently, like a sheep to the slaughter. The whole group seemed pleased to see me. They smiled in approval. 6 months later. Oh God, what a nightmare my life has become. I'm now a permanent member of the group with no way out. The worst part is that I've been unwillingly sucked into a dirty world of crime and corruption. The group plans unspeakable things during the meetings, and then every member is tasked with the execution. Trust me, it's a hellhole. And you sitting there and watching my story, if you think that you have a free will or control at least your world, well, let me break it to you. You're just a pawn. It's all controlled by such elite brotherhoods, such shitty men and women. I hate being one of them. I had had many first days at work. Too many that I'd lost count. But I was at my desk on the first day at this new job when I noticed him. I'd already begun my work, typing away at the computer, when I saw someone, ginger-haired with a freckled nose under his heavy glass frame, stop by the door. His eyes had been dull but lit, probably holding a smile before he'd come, and then it had disappeared when he saw me. I did not assume the strange situation an issue, but my heart dwelled in it long enough until I sensed him walk all the way from the door with careful steps until he arrived at his desk. I lifted my gaze the second time, and I flashed him a smile. His appearance turned quizzical, as though he was a scientist and I was an unwitting lab specimen which had caught his attention. I looked straight into his eyes for the brief moment, and I perceived his mood. It was confusion, and his perplexity corrupted my enthusiasm. I sought to put an end to it. "Good morning, mister," I said over the desk to him, and I waved for good measure. He sighed, and his eyes turned into a concerning ruefulness. "It's my first day here. I suppose you and I have yet to meet." He said nothing, as my words hung awkwardly unanswered between us both. I had nowhere to place my gaze, so I allowed them to wander shakily around the room. I looked back to my work, but his attention, which was still on me, made me uneasy. I'm sorry," I apologized with a shaky stammer, recounting my friendliness, which I perceived was not something he appreciated. "I didn't realize you don't like to speak in the morning." "Do you like coffee?" he asked with a straight face. His question was frank, and his mien was earnest, almost defeated. I had the sense that he did not care for my answer if it did not apply to an end which his question has intended, so I studied his import for what this might mean. I looked at the door, and it had no clues for me. We were alone in the office, and all of the tension came on my shoulders. I felt the cold urgency of obligation come on me. "Yeah, I like a little bit of coffee when I work," I blurted and ran my fingers across the table. "You know, the numbers can be a little dizzying sometimes." He did not seem to appreciate my humor because his features remained vague. I cussed under my breath in irritation because I tried to appeal to him and he had not seen the sense in it. There was no charisma about him that I could say captured my attention. But I perceived something in those stern green eyes of his that kept my interests. His airs were simple, and his outfit matched the disposition which he seemed to put on. "Would you mind getting cups for us?" he asked, rather politely. The only time his voice climbed to higher tone since we'd begun to speak. Sure," I said. And then I thought of it and wondered why I had agreed to his instructions. I did not work for him. It was a rather odd request to make to your colleague whom you just met for the first time. My fingers twitched, and I sensed he knew something I did not. The feeling that I had given my position away so quickly made me sick to my stomach. I decided to play along with it, allow him to enjoy the promise of control for a moment. "Do you know where to find it?" he asked as I walked towards the door. "I'd probably look around for it," I said to him. "You know, Rob and I shared coffee a lot. It was a morning ritual of ours," he said, just as I was about to step out. "The one time we did not, he was dead by noon. Heart attack, they said. That's Rob's desk you're sitting on. That was weeks ago." "I am so sorry," I muttered. "No milk, please. And be stingy with the sweetener," he said to me, carefully crafted information to shake me. "I was given 3 weeks off to mourn my friend, and I'm not sure my buds would agree to too much of a new thing." I sniffed and marched off in thought. Something was off, and realizing it came with a forceful chill which I could not shake off. I could sense the dread in his throat when he spoke, but I did not know what to make of it. I knew too little about the company's employees, and I'd only been hired because I'd proven myself at my previous job as one who could take care of things. I found the coffee maker quicker than I thought I would, and I pondered on his reason for carrying the guilt of his dead colleagues so dearly. He would need to come to terms with Rob's death, I thought to myself. Those who had hired me wanted a clean job in the books. When the cup of coffee was full, I noted his cup and started my walk back down the aisle. My mind still remained plagued with thoughts even as I walked back, and it took me a minute to realize someone walking in front of me. "Good morning," I said politely, holding the cups of coffee gently. "Hey, good morning," the man said back. I caught his appearance, and in a strange way I mused at how much he looked like someone who worked in the same office as me. My heart stopped cold, and the same panic which I hadn't felt in years made me numb. I stopped, and the man in front of me seemed to notice. He slowed and looked at me with the cups of coffee in both my hands. "Are you new here?" he asked almost nonchalantly. "Yes," I said, and immediately I stretched out my hands. "I suppose you work in the same office as me, and it struck me as something curious. You care for coffee?" I cackled with light humor. He reached his hands out and grabbed the cup of coffee. He took a swig of it and continued the march. The other cup of coffee in my hand was useless. My mind wore itself out from racing so quickly. I rolled my tongue in my mouth as we continued to march. The clock of my mind did a small countdown as I marched in the company of this strange man towards the door, and my heart beat rapidly. I hated to think too much about work. I pulled the door open and we entered. The freckled, bespectacled man turned around curiously and looked at us with the phone to his ears, red with passion. "Who are you, and why are you on my desk?" the stranger asked the bespectacled man. "Fuck!" I cusped. My own horror drenched me with sweat. He was most probably the man who killed Rob, and I was being set up to take the fall for both murders. "Ah!" he cried, grabbing on his chest as he fell to the ground, writhing in pain. "That was for me, wasn't it?" The bespectacled man smiled at me as we both watched the worker grapple on the floor as the effect of the poison suffocated him. "That was a good job you've done." It filled me with great fear and paranoia that my work had been carefully coordinated by a man who controlled me like a puppet. Even the knife I intended to stab him with did not seem so useful anymore. "I'll send your fee across," he said coldly, grabbed his bag from the desk and walked away, leaving me with great fear at the power which he had held over me in a matter of minutes since I had seen him.